The roar of the Roman crowd was unlike anything the world had ever known. It was a sound that belonged not to celebration, but to hunger, a hunger for spectacle, for power, for blood. Beneath the blazing sun of the Colosseum, tens of thousands gathered, draped in fine silks and perfumes, their eyes fixed upon the sand where men and women ceased to be human and became instruments of entertainment. The empire called it glory, but for those beneath the arena, it was the sound of the world ending. Rome had built its greatness upon conquest, and with every conquest came prisoners, captives torn from lands across Africa, Gaul, Thrace and Britannia. They were paraded through the streets, chained, broken, stripped of dignity. Some were condemned to the mines, others to slavery, but the most unfortunate were chosen for the games. For them, death was not a sentence, it was a performance. The gladiators were icons of power and fear. To the Roman people, they were heroes of the sand, symbols of courage and masculinity. But behind the walls of the ludus, the gladiator schools, the truth was far more merciless. They were slaves, forced to fight not for honor, but for survival, trained to kill or die for the pleasure of an audience that called itself civilized. The prisons beneath the arenas were filled with those deemed unworthy of life, rebels, criminals, and above all, foreign captives. And among them were women. The empire had little regard for mercy and less for innocence. When prisoners were sent to the games, they were stripped not only of their freedom, but of their humanity. The women brought into the Colosseum were treated as props, trophies of war, bodies to be used as warnings to nations that defied Rome. They were paraded before the crowd, draped in chains, their names forgotten. The emperor and senators looked on from marble seats, watching human suffering turned into theatre. The gladiators themselves, many of them slaves and soldiers taken from the edges of the empire, were part of this machinery of cruelty. Their strength, their fame, their fleeting privilege in the eyes of the mob made them instruments of propaganda. They were pitted not only against each other, but against the weakest, prisoners sent to die in mock battles designed to amuse the public. Rome called it spectaculum, spectacle, but for the prisoners it was humiliation crafted into art. The arena floor was a stage where every scream became applause. The emperors used these games to remind their people of power, to show that rebellion, disobedience and defiance ended not in exile but in agony. Women who had once been priestesses, wives of kings or daughters of soldiers stood beside lions, condemned for crimes as simple as survival. The crowd would cheer, not from hatred but from fascination, as the line between justice and cruelty disappeared entirely. In that world, even the gladiators were victims of the same system they appeared to dominate. They were kept in barracks, treated like prized animals. Their lives were measured in victories, their worth in blood spilled. The women prisoners were not merely punished, they were used as reminders that in Rome, mercy was weakness and compassion was treason. Many were forced into the arena as part of grotesque reenactments of myth, stories where mortals offended the gods and paid the price. Only here the gods were the Roman elite, and the punishment was real. The cruelty of the games was not chaos, it was calculated. It kept the masses distracted, fed on violence so they would not question their rulers. Every emperor knew that to control the crowd, he must feed its suffering. The prisoners, whether men or women, became offerings to the empire's appetite. And as the people cheered, Rome called it justice. If you wish to uncover more stories like this, the hidden truths behind empires that called their cruelty glory, and the forgotten voices of those crushed beneath marble and myth, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because the truth about what happened inside Rome's arenas will change the way you see history forever. Beneath the Colosseum, in the dim corridors where blood never dried, the gladiators waited for their turn to step into the light. Some prayed to forgotten gods, others sharpened blades that would soon drink the blood of strangers. The air was heavy with sweat, iron and fear. The prisoners were brought in next, shackled, trembling, surrounded by guards who wore the faces of indifference. They were told their deaths would please the gods of Rome, But there were no gods left in that place, only men who believed themselves divine. When the gates opened and the prisoners were led into the arena, the light blinded them. The crowd rose in a single voice, chanting, demanding the spectacle they had come to see. For a moment it felt as though the heavens themselves watched in silence. The prisoners, the gladiators, the executioners, all became part of one vast ritual, one that transformed pain into entertainment, cruelty into ceremony, and the destruction of innocence into proof of imperial greatness. What Rome called civilization was built upon the bones of those it silenced, and inside that arena, the truth of humanity was stripped away, leaving only the roar of a crowd that mistook blood for beauty. The crowd in the Colosseum did not see the prisoners as people. To them these were symbols, enemies conquered, bodies owned, reminders of Rome's strength. When the gates opened and the condemned stepped onto the sand, the audience cheered not because of who they were, but because of what they represented, the empire's right to decide who lived and who died. It was a theatre of dominance, where compassion was forbidden and cruelty was ritual. Among the prisoners were women from distant lands, captives taken after rebellions, survivors of cities razed by the legions, mothers torn from their children, queens stripped of their crowns. They were displayed before the crowd as spoils of conquest, their dignity erased by spectacle. They were told they would die as part of a lesson to those who defied Rome. But in truth, their deaths were no lesson at all. They were only entertainment. The gladiators who stood before them were bound to the same fate, in a different form. Though the people worshipped them as heroes, their lives were owned by their lanista, the man who trained and rented them for combat. They were commodities in flesh and iron, slaves with scars for medals. They had no choice in whom they faced, no say in who died beneath their blade. For the prisoners, the fight meant terror and loss. For the gladiators, it meant survival. Both were victims, trapped within an empire that had turned suffering into ceremony. The emperor's thumb ruled life and death. When it lifted, mercy prevailed. When it turned downward, Rome devoured. But mercy was rare. Mercy was weakness, and emperors sought to prove their strength through spectacle. Even the gods were invoked to bless the cruelty. Priests chanted, incense rose, and the crowd roared in unison as the prisoners were driven into mock battles, reenactments of conquered wars, mythological punishments, and fabricated betrayals. The Romans called it munera, a gift to the dead and to the empire. It was a gift soaked in blood. The historians who later chronicled these games wrote with careful detachment, as if describing storms or harvests. They did not record the faces of the condemned, nor the cries that echoed through the vaults beneath the arena. But every stone of the Colosseum remembers. The walls absorbed centuries of screams, prayers, and last breaths. For the prisoners, especially the women, there was no dignity left to reclaim, only the hope that death would come swiftly. Outside the amphitheatre, the city celebrated. Markets sold amulets and charms carved in the likeness of gladiators. Children played mock battles in the streets, pretending to strike down unseen foes. Rome was addicted to its own brutality. The spectacle had become a language through which the empire spoke to itself, a reminder that order came from domination, that life's value was determined by the applause of the crowd. Yet even among the gladiators, there were those who began to see the emptiness of their victories. Some had been free men once, soldiers, rebels, or slaves who had earned their weapons in blood. They fought because they must, but behind their hardened eyes lay the understanding that they too were prisoners of Rome's pride. The women they faced were not enemies, but mirrors reflecting their own captivity. And though few dared to defy the system, a silence grew among them, a shared, wordless guilt that lingered after every match. There are accounts of certain games where the crowd demanded something new, where the cruelty escalated to outdo itself. Exotic animals, fire, and even poison were introduced to make death more theatrical. The prisoners were dressed as goddesses, witches, and rebels. forced to play parts written by the men who owned them. Their fates were sealed before the first blow was struck. The audience saw not humans, but symbols of defeat, of empire, of Rome's right to rule all things. In that theatre of agony, every scream was a declaration of imperial glory. But empires built on suffering are never eternal. As the centuries passed, the same cruelty that once entertained began to disgust. Philosophers and poets started to question the games, to write of the moral decay consuming Rome. Seneca spoke of the crowds losing their souls in the noise of the arena. Even some emperors began to doubt, though few dared to stop it. The machinery of death had become too powerful, too woven into the identity of the people. The women who died in those arenas never had their names recorded. History buried them beneath marble and myth, yet their silence remains louder than the cheers that once drowned it. Their suffering became the hidden heartbeat of an empire that called itself civilized while bathing in blood. And though centuries have passed, the lesson endures, that power without empathy becomes monstrosity, and that every empire that delights in pain writes its own downfall. The Colosseum still stands, its arches open to the wind, its sands long dry. Tourists walk the same paths where chains once dragged across stone. They look upon the ruins and see history. But if they listen closely, they might hear the faint echo of what once was, the cries of those who were silenced, the hollow applause of a people who mistook cruelty for strength. Rome's greatest monument is not to its triumphs, but to its tragedy. What the gladiators did, what the emperors ordered, what the people cheered for, all were part of the same story. A story of how humanity can vanish behind the mask of civilization. The arena was not only a place of death, it was a mirror, reflecting what happens when the thirst for power devours the soul of a nation. If this story made you see the ancient world differently, not as marble and legend, but as the echoes of human cruelty and remorse, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because behind every great empire lies a silence full of ghosts, and the truth of Rome's greatness is not in its monuments, but in the pain of those it chose to forget.